Well, from the foyer of the House of Commons this evening, I'm joined by 4 members of Parliament to look ahead to the TMX decision on Tuesday. Paul Lefebvre is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources. Shannon Stubbs is the Natural Resources Critic for the official opposition Conservatives. Peter Julian is the House Leader and Energy Critic for the NDP. And Paul Manley is a Green Member of Parliament, joins us tonight. Good to see you all.
Good to be here.
Mr. Lefebvre, let me start with you. The government is being a little bit coy, I think, about whether it will announce it's pushing ahead with the expansion of the Trans Mountain pipeline on Tuesday, but I think most people think that will be the decision. You bought the pipeline. Should we expect it will be approved by Cabinet on Tuesday?
Listen, right now, Peter, you're speculating as to the decision by Cabinet. Tomorrow, Cabinet is going to be making a decision. As you know, we're in the process because of the Federal Court of Appeal decision that asked us to make sure that we review the marine scoping with looking at the effect on this other resident killer whale, and make sure that we get the environmental issues right that had not been reviewed before, and as well as our duty to consult, that we had not fully met it and that we need to continue. We're focusing on getting the process right, and then tomorrow, the Cabinet will be seized with all of the findings from the n.e.b. report, as well as the report from the department with respect to duty to consult.
What's the other option here? My understanding is Minister Sohi's suggested the latest round of consultations has been completed and done. So what would the other option be if it's not to say you're pushing ahead with it?
Well, there's actually there's actually 3 options. One is to move ahead, 2 is not to move ahead, and 3 is to determine if we're satisfied, the Cabinet is satisfied with that the consultations are complete to their satisfaction, and if not, to further do some consultations. So those are the 3 options that are there.
How would you explain not moving ahead after buying a $4.5 billion pipeline?
Well, again, like I said, because we're looking at all the facts, we have an obligation for our duty to consult. We take that very seriously, and as well as with respect to the n.e.b. report, they have to provide some recommendations and some conditions. Cabinet has to make a decision as to whether it can follow through on those conditions and on those recommendations. So we have to look at all the facts that are there in order to make a full decision, and that's what Canadians expect of us.
All right, Shannon Stubbs, Conservatives still seem to be, based on question period today, you still seem convinced that the Liberals might approve the expansion of the project, but then let it sit idle. If that's their intention, why buy it in the first place?
Well, because, of course, buying it when the finance minister promised at the time would get construction started, quote, immediately, and it didn't. Not a single inch has been built. So I think the majority of Canadians expect the Liberals to approve the Trans Mountain expansion again, because they already did once in 2016. The majority of Canadians want the Trans Mountain expansion to be built, as do the vast majority of Indigenous communities directly impacted by it. But what will be crucial tomorrow is not just that the Liberals approve the Trans Mountain expansion, but that they give a concrete plan this time as to how it is actually going to be built. The Liberals need to answer what they are going to do with expected new court challenges from other levels of government, what the overall cost to taxpayers will be, who will own and operate the pipeline in the long term. They must answer all of these questions tomorrow when they approve it.
All right, Mr. Julian, why do you believe that pushing ahead with Trans Mountain would be a mistake?
Well, first off, I think it's just a rubber stamp that we're going to hear about tomorrow. I mean, the government's poured $5 billion in. The estimated cost is another $10 to $12 billion on top of that. So we're talking about a $15 to $17 billion project that David Anderson, the former Liberal minister, says that there's simply no business case for it. So when we look at the impacts on climate change, when we look at the fact that ultimately it's $17 billion that could be spent on affordable housing, on a whole variety of renewable energy initiatives, on farming care, on dental care, this is simply a bad deal for Canadians. But Mr. Trudeau seems to see it as a bottomless pit that he's just willing to pour money into, and I find that unfortunate. The fight is not going to end there. Of course, we've got the province of British Columbia, the cities of Vancouver and Burnaby, a whole range of Indigenous communities all pushing back, and so all of these organizations and representative bodies will simply go back to court.
All right, Mr. Manley, Greens oppose this as well. What do you expect to hear tomorrow?
Well, I expect to hear that the government's going to be moving forward on it, because they've spent $4.5 billion on this, and they've bought the expansion portion of it. They're really between a rock and a hard place. That they're going to be pushing emissions up some 13 to 15 megatons. If this is about expanding tar sands production rather than diverting what's being exported to the United States, and I think it's about expansion. So this is putting their climate action rhetoric really in the front window to see that they're not very serious about climate action when they're building a pipeline. The economic case for this doesn't make any sense. We've heard from David Anderson, but also from Robin Allen and people like Gordon Laxer who say that you know, this is just going to be going down to California. They're going to be exporting diluted bitumen and sending it to refineries in California and not to Asia.
Mr. Lefebvre, let me have you weigh in on that and on a couple of things. Start there with, is there still a business case for the expansion of this pipeline? And secondly, what is the government going to do? Because we know this will end up back in court. We expect there'll be lots of protests. Are you going to actively push this forward? And what are you going to do about those court challenges?
We know that there's obviously a lot of different opinions on this, obviously on this project and on the process as well. And for us tomorrow, actually, Cabinet is seized to making a decision on the process. What's important as well is, you know, we've always been the party that says the economy and the environment can go hand in hand. And that's why we need to be looking at ways that we can support the economy as well as the environment. And again, those are all factors that'll be coming into the decision by Cabinet tomorrow.
Right, but after all this process, if you decide to push ahead with, are you, as you once talked about, are you prepared to legislate moving this forward, to legislate against protests, to legislate against court cases, to invoke the full power of the federal government's position here to say not only did we approve it, but we are now starting construction and it will get built?
I think now, right, Peter, you're speculating and you're putting the cart before the horse here. Right now,
I'm asking. If you approve, if you say, yeah, we are giving approval to it, but there's no plan to then build it, what's the importance of the approval?
Again, those things will come out as the process moves forward. Tomorrow is the decision day, and then from there, all of the questions that you're asking can be answered at that point.
Okay, Shannon, Stubbs, the messaging we're hearing around this, I think, will be that, look, if there's a decision to go ahead and approve the pipeline, the government will say, yeah, we're approving the pipeline, but don't forget, look over here as well. We're restricting oil transport on the BC North Coast. We're overhauling the environmental assessment regime so we can have our environmental protection and new energy developments at the same time. Does that work?
Well, Canada has always had a world-leading track record being the most environmentally and socially responsible energy producer in the world. The Liberals ran a campaign attacking Canada's long-term track record, and they've lied when they've said things like environmental protection was gutted or Indigenous communities were never consulted on resource projects before. That's just absolutely false. And so to your questions to my colleague about the important details that the Liberals will need to divulge tomorrow, they absolutely have to do that, because clearly an approval is one thing, but getting it built is another. Canadians should remember the Trans Mountain expansion was supposed to be complete and in service by the end of this year, by the end of 2019. The Bank of Canada is already predicting that there will be no new energy investment in Canada after 2019, and that is a big deal because it's the #1 private sector investor in the Canadian economy and Canada's biggest export. The catastrophic impacts of that loss investment is rippling across all sectors and across provinces. But what energy developers are actually saying about C69 and C48, along with hundreds of Indigenous communities, businesses, provinces, municipalities, manufacturers, and chambers, is that those two bills will have very damaging economic consequences.
Let me move your colleague, Mr. Julian. Mr. Julian, that's, I think, part of the argument we're going to hear tomorrow, if there is approval for Trans Mountain expansion, is that, yeah, we're doing the pipeline, but don't forget, we're overhauling the environmental assessment process, and we're dealing with tanker traffic in the north. So, we're not just giving away the story here. What's your response to that?
Well, first off, it's a climate emergency that we're living through. It costs the average Canadian family now already about $600 a year. The impacts of climate change will be felt even more considerably in the coming years. So for the government to say, well, we've done a few small things, so let this pass, just doesn't seem to make sense. The other issue is the investment in the energy sector in renewable energy. We have a federal government that is simply absent from the kind of investments that Jagmeet Singh has been talking about, where we would create 300,000 new jobs in renewable energy. That's where the federal government needs to go. And I think a lot of Canadians will judge the appalling record of both the Conservatives and the Liberals in government next October. And I certainly hope what we'll see is Jagmeet Singh's opportunity to put in place a plan that will lead to hundreds of thousands thousands of jobs in the clean energy sector.
Mr. Manley, let me give the final word to you here. So what is, if that's the argument that, yeah, there's a pipeline, we're approving it, we want to push forward with the expansion, but look at all the other things we're doing to protect the environment. How should Canadians value that conversation?
Well, I think that's ridiculous. As Peter was saying, we need to be putting money into clean energy projects and investing in clean energy. Right now, we have 85% of the population in the provinces and territories that represent 85% of the population are about to meet the Copenhagen targets that were set for 2020. Two provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, have taken the amount that those other provinces have reduced and increased their emissions by that same amount, so that they now produce 50% of the emissions in this country. And it's time that the oil and gas sector had their emissions curbed, and we need to ramp down the oil sands. We do not need to be expanding the oil sands. We do not need any more export of raw bitumen and raw product from this country. We need to get serious about the climate emergency, and we need to focus on energy projects that are clean and green. So hydroelectric, solar, wind, geothermal. We have people who are working in the oil sector that have transferable skills, and we can put them to work working on clean energy projects, and that's the way that we need to be moving forward to deal with the climate emergency that we face.
To be clear, of the private sector investment beyond utilities and taxpayers, private sector investment, the biggest investors in alternative and renewable energy technology are oil sands, conventional oil and gas, and pipeline companies. That's the truth in Canada. So it makes no sense for anti-energy activists to say they want to drive energy investment out of Canada while also saying they want to see this long-term technology and innovation development. That is one of the very risks of these anti-energy policies.
Very quickly, hang on. In fairness now, Mr. Julian, quickly, and then I'll hear from Mr. Lefebvre.
But part of the problem, Peter, is that we heavily invest in subsidizing the oil and gas lobby.
That's not true.
So billions of dollars every year. Instead of that going into renewable energy, is going to for the oil and gas sector. I come from the oil and gas sector. I'm the only MP here that's actually worked in an oil refinery on Parliament Hill. But I believe firmly that spending billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to subsidize oil and gas does not make sense. We need to put that into renewables.
Mr. Lefebvre, so you see, I'm asking, there's going to be lots of questions. Even after this announcement tomorrow, there's still lots of work to do, right?
Exactly. And for us, it's basically making sure that we protect the environment as well as develop our resources responsibly. That's why we have invested heavily, actually historically, on renewables and on the environment protection. That we've done more than any other government has ever done. And that's why we will wait to the decision tomorrow and then see how we move from there.
All right, lots of questions tonight, and lots of questions tonight, and lots of questions to follow tomorrow, I think. Thank you all for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.